Have you noticed how some nights you come home more tired than when you left? Not physically, something quieter, like your mind was drained, not your body. You sat with people. You laughed at the right moments. You nodded when expected. And yet, walking back, there was this hollow space inside you that wasn't there before. That feeling isn't weakness, it's information. You were taught that connection heals, that being around people is always better than being alone. But no one warned you that most connection today is just noise with a human face. You feel it when conversations loop, when jokes land but say nothing, when you speak, yet nothing real leaves your mouth. Here's the uncomfortable part. You didn't feel empty because you were alone. You felt empty because you weren't allowed to be yourself. Notice how silence feels heavier in a crowd than in a room by yourself. That's not coincidence. That's your mind detecting friction. Presence without depth costs energy. It always has. We're told isolation is dangerous, but look closer. What actually drains you? The quiet night at home, or the forced performance of being on, the endless smiling, the constant reacting, the subtle pressure to be interesting instead of honest? Here's the shift most people never try. Treat solitude not as escape, but as an experiment. Stay home not to hide, but to observe what returns when the noise fades. Watch what thoughts show up when there's nothing demanding a reaction from you. There's a reason silence feels uncomfortable at first. It removes the buffer. It reveals how much of your social life is maintenance, not meaning. How much of it is habit, not choice. People say humans are social animals. True, but they forget we are also reflective ones, and reflection needs space. Think about it. When was the last time a crowded room gave you clarity? When did small talk ever leave you stronger than you arrived? Here's the quiet truth most won't say out loud. A lot of connection today is performance. Polished, repeated, safe. It looks alive, but it doesn't feed you. It keeps you busy enough to forget you're hungry. Solitude does the opposite. It removes the distraction. It forces you to sit with your own thoughts until they stop performing and start speaking. That's why it scares people. Not because it's empty, but because it's honest. And honesty asks something from you. This is where the experiment begins, not isolation, not withdrawal, just one evening where you don't trade your attention for noise, where you let the discomfort pass instead of escaping it. Something interesting happens then. You start to feel a quiet clarity returning, not pleasure, not happiness, orientation. And once you taste that, a question appears that doesn't go away easily. If being alone gives you more of yourself, why are you so eager to give that away? Notice how silence makes people uneasy. Not the quiet of a room, but the quiet inside their own head. That's the kind they rush to escape. They turn on noise, open apps, start talking. Anything to avoid that moment when nothing distracts them. You felt it too, that strange drop after a night out. You smiled, nodded, played your part. You were there, and yet something in you felt thinner when you got home, like you spent energy pretending instead of living. That discomfort isn't random, it's a signal. Most people say they fear loneliness, but that's not accurate. What they really fear is what shows up when no one else is there to mirror them back to themselves. Silence removes the costume, and suddenly you're face to face with questions you've been postponing. Here's the shift most never try. Instead of escaping that moment, stay inside it a little longer. Don't explain it, don't fix it. Just observe what rises when the noise dies. There's a difference between being alone and being empty. One strips you down, The other slowly drains you. Most people confuse the two. Look around. Crowded rooms, endless conversations, everyone speaking, few saying anything. It feels alive, but something's missing. Depth, friction, risk. You can talk for hours and never be seen. That's the uncomfortable truth. Much of what we call connection is performance, polished reactions, safe opinions, emotional autopilot. It keeps things smooth, but it never touches the core. Now ask yourself this, and don't answer too fast. When was the last time a conversation actually changed you? Not entertained you, changed you. You have dozens of contacts, hundreds of faces in your feed, and still there's that quiet sense of distance. Not because you lack people, but because you rarely bring your real self into the room. Most don't. It's safer to stay agreeable than honest. Safer to be liked than understood. Here's the experiment. Next time you feel that pull to fill the silence, pause. Let it stretch. Let the discomfort speak first. See what thought tries to surface before you push it away. If something interesting happens then, you begin to notice how much of your social life is noise management, how little of it is truth. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because real connection isn't loud, it's rare. It doesn't perform, it doesn't rush. It requires something most people avoid giving. Presence. And the question that starts to haunt you is simple. If depth only appears in quiet, why are you so afraid to stay there a little longer? You've felt this before. You're sitting with people you know, maybe even people you like. The room is warm, the talk is easy, and still, something inside you starts pulling back, quietly, almost politely. You nod, you smile, you say the right things, and at the same time you feel yourself thinning out. That moment matters. Because what you're feeling isn't boredom, it's cost. There's a point where connection stops giving and starts taking, where every sentence you shape is slightly edited, where every reaction is filtered. Not because you're fake, but because full honesty would be too heavy for the room. You've been there, saying less than you think, feeling more than you show. Leaving with a strange fatigue you can't explain. That's the first crack. Most people assume sociability is a skill, something to improve, something to master. But what if it's a trade? What if every interaction quietly asks for a piece of you in return? Not money, not time. Something subtler, attention, energy, truth. Here's the uncomfortable part. The more aware you become, the more expensive most conversations feel. You start noticing how often you shrink to fit, how often you translate yourself into something easier to digest, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. This is where the shift happens. Not a belief, an experiment. Stop trying to be pleasant for a moment, not rude, not cold, just still. See what remains when you stop performing warmth, when you stop smoothing the edges. There's a strange relief there. And also a quiet fear. Because when you're no longer trying to be accepted, you risk discovering how rarely you actually are. Most people never cross that line. They choose comfort over clarity, noise over depth, familiar faces over honest presence. But notice what happens when you don't chase connection, when you let the silence stretch just a little longer than feels safe. You start to feel whole again. Not louder, not happier. Whole. That's when another truth shows up. Social life is a transaction. Every interaction costs something: attention, energy, self-betrayal, sometimes all three. Most people never calculate that cost. They just keep paying it. Smiling through exhaustion, agreeing through doubt, trading authenticity for smoothness, and the price adds up. Here's the quiet paradox. The moment you stop needing company, you become capable of real connection. Because now you're choosing, not compensating. This isn't about isolation. It's about precision, about knowing when connection feeds you and when it drains you. And once you feel that difference in your body, not your head, one question starts to follow you everywhere. If being alone makes you more whole, why did you ever believe that constant company was the cure? You're not imagining the fatigue. It's not random. You're paying for every interaction with something real. Attention, presence, pieces of yourself that don't grow back quickly. Think about the last time you went out. Not the highlight, the in-between moments, the constant adjusting, the subtle checking of faces, the quiet calculation of what version of you fits this room. You weren't resting, you were working. That's the part no one names. You felt it afterward. That dull emptiness, not sadness, drain. Like something valuable leaked out while you weren't watching. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most social spaces charge a fee, not money, awareness. You spend it to stay acceptable. You pay it to stay smooth. And the cost is always higher than you expect. Now pause. Try a different frame. Not isolation, not withdrawal. An experiment. What happens when you stop performing for a few hours? When you stop shaping yourself into something easy to digest? When you don't explain, don't entertain, don't smooth the edges, notice what rises first. Restlessness, guilt, the urge to check something, to be seen, to be validated. That's the noise talking. There's a difference between being alone and being free. Most people never test it. They confuse company with safety and silence with danger. But the opposite often happens. In company, you're watched, measured, adjusted. Even with people you love, there's a quiet awareness of being perceived, a soft pressure to stay coherent, like you're on a stage that never fully closes. Alone, that pressure drops. You don't need to explain your mood. You don't need to perform interest. You don't need to translate yourself. And something strange happens. Your thoughts slow down. Not because you're tired, but because they're no longer competing. That's when you realize something most people miss. The exhaustion wasn't from living, it was from maintaining an image. Here's the uncomfortable part. Many people avoid solitude not because it's empty, but because it reveals how much of their life is built on reaction, on approval, on noise that keeps deeper questions quiet. So they stay busy, stay connected, stay occupied. But ask yourself this carefully. When was the last time you sat alone and didn't feel the need to escape? Not distract, not scroll, not plan. Just exist. That moment is rare and valuable because once you feel it, you start to notice how much of the world is designed to pull you away from it. Status, applause, motion, endless signals telling you to want more, be more, show more. And yet, none of it gives what it promises. The real shift begins when you see that solitude isn't deprivation, it's filtration. It strips away what isn't yours, and then a different question appears. Quietly, without force. If your energy is finite, who or what is actually worth spending it on? That question doesn't ask for an answer yet. It just waits. You've seen it happen. You open a screen and instantly measure yourself. Someone has more success, more attention, more proof that they matter. And without saying it out loud, something inside you tightens. That's not motivation, that's pressure. The world trains you to compare because comparison keeps you moving, scrolling, reaching, performing. It feeds the ego, not because the ego is strong, but because it's hungry. And hunger is easy to control. But there's another part of you that doesn't respond to noise. A quieter part. One that doesn't light up when you win approval. One that actually feels tired when you chase it. You've felt that fatigue after checking updates, after seeing who's ahead, after asking yourself again if you're enough yet. That's the moment most people ignore. Instead of asking why they feel empty, they double down. More goals, more stimulation, more comparison. But that never fills the gap. It just keeps it busy. Try this shift instead. Not a belief, an experiment. Step away from the scoreboard for a moment, not forever, just long enough to notice what happens when no one is watching you measure yourself. At first, there's discomfort, a strange anxiety, like you're falling behind, even though nothing is happening. That's the ego panicking. It runs on attention the way fire runs on oxygen. But stay there. Soon something else appears, a quieter signal. Thoughts that aren't shaped for approval, interests that don't need applause, questions that feel yours, not inherited. This is the part most people never reach. They mistake stillness for emptiness. They confuse silence with lack. But silence isn't empty, it's unfiltered. Look at how rarely people choose it. They say they want freedom, but they cling to noise. They want peace, but they fear what shows up when distractions fade. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of what you chase isn't desire. It's imitation. You wanted it because you saw someone else wanting it, and once you stop watching, the desire weakens. That's when something shifts. You begin to notice how much of the world is designed to keep you externally focused. Status, recognition, metrics, all of it pulling you outward, away from the one place where nothing can be taken from you. When you step back, even briefly, you feel it. A strange steadiness, not excitement, not comfort, something quieter, more solid. This is where clarity starts, not in achievement, in subtraction. And here's the question that lingers once you taste it. If so much of what you chase only matters when others are watching, what remains when you finally stop looking outwards? That's where the real work begins. It's full in there, not empty, not calm, full. Full of things you've been avoiding for a long time. Questions you scroll past. Thoughts you silence with sound. Realizations you delay by staying busy. You feel it the moment everything goes quiet. That slight pressure in the chest. That urge to reach for noise. Most people mistake that feeling for boredom. It isn't. It's contact. You already know this. You've felt it late at night, when the screen goes dark and the room doesn't distract you anymore, when the mind starts speaking in a tone you didn't invite. That's why people fill every gap. Music while walking, videos while eating, voices while falling asleep. Not because they enjoy it, but because silence asks something of them. Here's the uncomfortable part. Silence doesn't bring new thoughts. It reveals the ones you've been running from. Try this, just as an experiment. Sit somewhere without stimulation. No input, no scrolling, no background noise. Notice the first emotion that appears. It's rarely peace. It's often tension, restlessness, a subtle panic. That's the mind realizing it has nowhere to hide. Most people never stay long enough to see what comes next. They flee before the second layer appears. But if you wait, something shifts. The noise collapses, and what remains is quieter, heavier, more honest. This is where the real work begins. You start to notice how much of your identity is performance, how many opinions are borrowed, how many desires were installed by repetition. You see how often you've been reacting instead of choosing. That realization stings. But it's also clean. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. One is absence, the other is presence without distraction. One drains you, the other returns you to yourself. Most people never make that distinction. They keep chasing connection because being alone feels like failure, but that's a misunderstanding. Solitude isn't rejection. It's filtration. When the noise drops, Your mind stops echoing other people's thoughts. It begins to generate its own, slowly, awkwardly, honestly. This is where clarity starts. Not with answers, but with better questions. And here's the part few admit. Silence doesn't comfort you. It confronts you. It asks what you've been avoiding. It shows you where you're pretending. It points at the life you're living on autopilot. That's why it feels heavy at first. But stay a little longer. Because once you stop escaping yourself, something unexpected happens. You begin to trust your own voice again. Not the loud one, the steady one underneath. And when that voice returns, it changes how everything else sounds. So ask yourself this, and don't rush the answer. If you removed all the noise, would you finally hear who you've been becoming? It starts the moment you stop running, not physically, internally. When you stop filling the gaps with sound, updates, voices, that's when something unfamiliar moves in. Silence doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't explain itself. It just waits. And somehow that waiting feels heavier than noise. At first, you want to escape it. You reach for something to occupy your hands, your mind, your attention. But if you don't, if you stay still long enough, you notice something shift. The questions change. They stop asking for answers and start asking for honesty. That's when the surface begins to lose its shine. You start to see how much of modern life is built around staying stimulated, more connections, more conversations, more visibility. As if being surrounded by people automatically means being understood. But you've lived the opposite. You've been in rooms full of voices and still felt invisible. You've spoken for hours and said nothing that mattered. You've walked away from conversations, feeling lighter only because you left parts of yourself behind. That's not connection, that's noise. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people prefer that noise. It's easier than depth, easier than risk, easier than, being seen for who they actually are. So they talk, they repeat, they mirror, they borrow opinions, they stay busy enough to never notice the emptiness underneath. But once you've spent time alone, real alone, you start to sense the difference. Not intellectually, in your body, in your patience, in your tolerance for shallow exchange. You notice how few conversations actually nourish you, how rare it is to feel met rather than managed, how often words are used to fill space instead of reveal truth. This isn't arrogance, it's clarity. When you've heard your own thoughts without interruption, surface talk becomes hard to tolerate. Not because you're above it, but because you can feel the absence of depth. And then something shifts again. You stopped chasing connection for its own sake. You stop collecting people like proof of worth. You start listening for resonance instead of noise. You realize that real connection doesn't come from proximity. It comes from presence, from two people willing to stand still long enough to be honest. That kind of meeting is rare. That's why it matters. Most people never slow down enough to experience it. They confuse activity with meaning. They confuse being surrounded with being seen. But once you've touched that deeper layer, you can't unsee the difference. You begin to choose differently. Fewer words, fewer faces, more truth. And then a quiet question appears, one that doesn't demand an answer right away. If most connection is just sound, what would happen if you only listened for what actually reaches you? You start to notice it in small moments. A room full of people, laughter, noise, movement, and still you feel unseen, not ignored, just untouched. You talk, you respond, you play your part. But nothing lands, nothing stays. And on the way home, there's that quiet question again. What was the point of that? This is where the shift begins. You stop wanting more people. You start wanting fewer, but real, or maybe none at all for a while. Not because you dislike others, but because something inside you is tired of being diluted. That's not isolation, that's selection. Most people never learn the difference. They confuse connection with proximity. They think more faces means more meaning, but meaning doesn't multiply that way. It deepens or it disappears. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of what passes for connection is just mutual performance. You adjust, they adjust. Everyone stays agreeable, nobody risks being seen, and slowly you shrink. Every time you choose to blend in, something in you steps back. Every time you smooth an edge to fit the room, you lose a little definition. It's subtle, but it adds up. Now pause. Try a different experiment. Remove the audience. Sit with yourself long enough that there's no one left to impress, no one to explain yourself to, no role to play. Just you, unfiltered. At first, it's awkward, then it's uncomfortable, then it gets interesting. You start noticing what you actually think when you're not performing, what you actually want when no one is watching. What you've been avoiding because it doesn't fit the version of you that others expect. That's the moment most people turn back. It's easier to stay distracted than to face the parts of yourself that don't have a social use. But if you stay, something changes. You begin to see how much of your life has been shaped by quiet pressure, expectations you never agreed to, standards you never chose, desires borrowed from people who don't know you. That's the cost of constant connection. You're always being shaped by someone else's frame. Solitude reverses that, not by isolating you, but by returning you to yourself. It strips away the noise and shows you what remains when there's no audience to perform for. And what remains is usually smaller than you expected, but it's real. From there, connection changes. You no longer chase it, you choose it. You stop trying to be interesting and start being honest. That's when interactions stop draining you. That's when depth becomes possible. And that's the part most people never reach, because to get there, you have to stop running from yourself long enough to listen. So here's the question that lingers, quiet but persistent. If you stop performing tomorrow, who would you actually become? You notice it in small ways first. Moments when you're busy but not fulfilled. When your day is full, yet something essential feels untouched. You've been moving, talking, reacting, but nothing inside has shifted. That's the signal. Having more in yourself doesn't mean becoming smarter or more disciplined. It means something quieter. It means your thoughts don't come from the room anymore. They come from you, but that can't happen while your attention is always pointed outward. Every time you check what others are doing, thinking, approving, you delay something important. Not productivity, not success, yourself. There's a cost to constant engagement. You pay it in clarity. Most people never notice this cost because distraction feels productive. It feels like life is happening. But look closer. How much of that motion actually changes you? Here's the uncomfortable part. A lot of what you call being social is just performance. You play a role. You adjust your tone, you filter your thoughts, you keep the mask on because it works. It keeps things smooth. But every time you do that, something else goes quiet. That something is the part of you that thinks in its own rhythm. The part that asks questions without checking if they're acceptable. The part that notices what feels wrong before it can explain why. That part can't speak while you're busy being seen. So try a small experiment. Not a lifestyle change, not a vow, just a pause. Stay in one place longer than feels comfortable. Don't reach for stimulation. Let the silence stretch. Let it irritate you. Notice what shows up first. restlessness, boredom, a strange pressure to do something, anything. That's the noise burning off. Then something else appears, slower, quieter, more precise. This is where thinking actually begins, not the kind that reacts, the kind that connects, that takes fragments of experience and arranges them into meaning. That's where insight forms, not in motion but in stillness. Modern culture treats stillness like a flaw. If you're not producing, you're falling behind. If you're not visible, you're irrelevant. If you're not busy, you're wasting time. That belief keeps you moving, but never arriving. The truth is harder to accept. Growth doesn't happen in motion. It happens in digestion, in pauses long enough for experience to settle, in moments where nothing new enters and something old finally makes sense. You can't think deeply while constantly consuming. You can't know yourself while performing for others. That's why stepping back feels threatening. It exposes how much of your life has been reaction instead of choice. But that's also where power returns. When you stop filling every gap, your mind starts connecting things you didn't know were related. Ideas surface. Patterns click. You begin to recognize what actually matters to you, not what you were told should matter. That's the beginning of self-direction, not loud, not dramatic, quiet, stable, internal. And once you taste that, you start to see the world differently. You notice how much noise exists to prevent exactly this kind of clarity, which leads to the real question, the one that lingers long after the noise fades. If stillness is where you begin to meet yourself, why do you spend so much time running from it, not while rushing? Not while jumping from task to task? Not while checking your phone every few minutes to feel occupied? It only happens when nothing is pulling at you, when the room is quiet, when there's no demand waiting to be answered. When time stops pushing you forward, that's when something shifts. Most people never reach that moment. They stay in motion because stillness feels like falling behind. They confuse movement with meaning, noise with progress. But think about it. Every person who ever created something that lasted protected long stretches of silence, not by accident, by choice. They understood something most people avoid. Stillness isn't empty, it's charged. When the noise drops, something else becomes audible. Not inspiration, not brilliance. Something more basic. Your own thinking finally unblocked. That's uncomfortable at first, because it means sitting with thoughts you've been dodging, doubts, questions, half-formed ideas that don't fit clean narratives. It feels unproductive, it feels risky, but that's the threshold. There's a difference between being busy and being alive, between motion and direction. One exhausts you, the other builds something inside you. Here's the part most people miss. Depth doesn't come from effort, it comes from space. From letting your mind wander without pulling it back every few seconds. From trusting that something meaningful is forming even when nothing obvious is happening. Most people can't tolerate that phase. They call it boredom and escape it. They scroll, they distract. They keep the surface moving so they never have to face what's underneath. But the ones who stay learn something important. Stillness doesn't take from you. It gives back. It returns pieces of yourself you didn't know you'd lost. You start to notice patterns, connections, questions that actually matter to you, not the ones handed to you by noise. You stop reacting and start choosing. That's where power quietly forms. Not loud power, not social power, internal power, the kind that doesn't need approval or applause. When you stop chasing stimulation, you stop being owned by it. When you stop expecting the world to feed you meaning, you start generating it. And that's when everything changes. Because once you've felt what it's like to think without pressure, to sit without fleeing, to exist without performing, you can't unfeel it. The world will still rush. The noise will still call. But you'll know there's another way to live beneath it. And the real question becomes this: if stillness can give you access to that version of yourself, why would you keep running from it? You start to feel it when nothing is pulling at you. No messages, no tasks, no one expecting a version of you. Just you, sitting inside your own attention. At first, it's uncomfortable, too quiet, too exposed. You reach for something to fill the gap, a screen, a thought, a reason to move. But if you don't, something else happens. You begin to notice a different kind of strength forming, not loud, not impressive, quiet, stable, internal, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. This is where real independence begins. Not financial, not social, internal. Most people never develop it. They outsource their sense of worth. They wait for feedback, approval, reaction. They let the world tell them who they are and how much they matter. And that works until it doesn't. Because the moment the noise stops, so does their sense of self. You weren't born that way. You weren't born comparing. You weren't born performing. You weren't born adjusting your truth to fit a room. Those habits were learned. And anything learned can be unlearned. Here's the shift most people miss. Stillness isn't absence, it's capacity. It's where you start generating meaning instead of consuming it. When you sit with yourself long enough, something changes. You stop reacting. You start choosing. You notice patterns in your thoughts. You see which desires are yours and which ones were installed. That's power. Not control over others. Control over attention, over direction, over what deserves your energy. This is where self-trust is built. Not from affirmations, from exposure, from staying present when there's nothing to hide behind. Most people avoid this because it's uncomfortable, because it reveals contradictions, because it asks honesty. But that discomfort is temporary. What comes after is steadiness. You begin to feel less pulled by every signal, less shaken by other people's moods, less desperate for approval. You start to choose your inputs carefully. You protect your time. You protect your mind. You learn to say no without explaining yourself. That's not isolation. That's sovereignty. And here's the quiet truth. The world will keep asking for more of you. Your attention, your energy, your agreement. It will never stop. So the question becomes simple, and it doesn't need an answer right away. If you don't guard your inner space, who do you think will? People will keep performing. They always do. The noise won't stop. The invitations will keep coming. The feeds will keep refreshing. The world will keep asking for your attention like it's owed something. But there's a moment most people never notice. A quiet fork in the road. It happens when you realize you don't have to answer every call. You don't have to be available. You don't have to prove anything today. That moment feels dangerous at first. Like you're stepping out of rhythm. Like you're falling behind. That discomfort is real. And it's important. Because it's the first sign you're choosing instead of reacting. Most people never make that choice. They move from one demand to the next, mistaking motion for meaning. They think visibility equals value. They think being wanted equals being whole. But pause for a second. Who are you when no one is looking? Not the version you perform, the one underneath. That's the question most people avoid, not because it's hard, but because it's honest. You can feel it when you stop chasing approval. There's a quiet tension at first, a sense of loss, like something familiar is slipping away. And it is. You're letting go of the version of yourself that survived by being liked. That's not weakness. That's transition. There's a difference between being alone and being abandoned. One is absence, the other is choice. One drains you, the other returns you to yourself. When you choose solitude intentionally, something shifts. You stop asking the world who to be. You start listening for your own rhythm. You begin to notice how much of your life was built around avoiding disapproval rather than pursuing truth. That's uncomfortable. It should be. Because once you see it, you can't pretend anymore. You see how often you shapeshift to fit rooms that were never meant for you, how often you trade depth for acceptance, how often you shrink to stay included, and then a quieter strength appears. You start choosing what actually matters. You protect your energy. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening anyway. You stop chasing validation and start building alignment. This isn't isolation, it's orientation. The world will still be loud. It will still ask for your attention. It will still reward performance over presence. But you'll know something it doesn't teach, that peace doesn't come from being seen. It comes from being honest with yourself when no one else is there. And once you taste that, really taste it, something irreversible happens. You stop disappearing into noise. You start standing in your own silence. So the question isn't whether you'll be alone sometimes. The question is this: when the noise fades and nothing is watching, who do you choose to become?